Welcome, Eric. Thanks so much for joining me today to chat about adaptive leadership in preparation for the upcoming Learning Lab that we have on May 16th. Would love to hear more about yourself and what you do. What's your intro?
Well, where to begin? I think it's this question of, who am I? What's my story? My father once said to me, when you go on vacation and you come back, or if you've lived overseas for any period of time and you come back and people say, "How was your trip?" You have maybe like 5 minutes to tell them about the whole trip, so he'd say, tell a different story every time. Tell a true story, but tell a different story, because if you just tell one story about who you are or where you've been, that becomes your only story. So I'm listening to the invitation to introduce myself here, thinking, what is the story I want to tell? I think for me, this idea of leadership came up probably firstly as a young child growing up in Detroit. So for folks who might be listening to this video who know anything about Detroit here in the United States, it was a rough place to live. We were the arson capital of the world for many years, the murder capital of the world, and there was just a tremendous amount of decay in the city that was really a harbinger for a lot of what was happening, the erosion of the middle class in this country. And so as a young child watching literally every summer, we have spring right now where I am, and as spring and summer set in, you could see the decay. You could see the houses crumbling. You could see the streets crumbling. Crime would increase. And so I kind of sat there every year as a kid saying, why doesn't somebody do something about this? A mayor, a business person in the community, a mother or a father. And I was just really struck how really good people, even good intentioned, good hearted people, can do things or not do things for that matter that aren't in their best interest. And so, for me, that was the curiosity, is when you see that things are getting progressively worse around you or could be better, what is it that keeps people from doing something about it? I became an engineer thinking that maybe engineers are pretty smart and they know how to solve these kind of problems. But, no surprise to you, I'm sure, Danielle, working in international development and social impact is, even in places like that, smart places, committed places, you still see people who are kind of doing things despite their best interests. And so for me, that was a really confusing time. Say, well, gosh, I thought engineers could fix anything, and there's problems they can fix, certainly, which we'll talk about later on in this interview probably. There's a lot of things they can't. And so I think for me, the journey has been one of kind of going from that left side of my brain, that analytical side, to the right side, which is more about people and processes and systems and feelings, which is not some things an engineer that you get learned, or you learn how to talk about or work with. So that's been the journey, I think, is from the left side of my brain to the right. And while I'm told that's only about 2 or 3 inches, it's taken me about 40 years to get there.
I can imagine it's quite a shift, but so now you have a more well-rounded view of how to tackle some of the challenges and develop more leadership skills that might, like you said, not everything can be solved with a cut and dry, step-by-step engineering solution. So how were you first introduced to this journey on the other side of your brain in terms of leadership as a practice and as a field of study? How did that start?
Well, I mean, there again, there's two stories. So there's the story in hindsight, which sounds something like, I'm an engineer by training, always interested in kind of big systems type things. And after I've been living in Japan for many years, which at the time I was there was very much the center of this whole world of management, and leadership theory, because it seemed like the Japanese were doing something quite special at the time. But when I came back to the States, I got involved in international development with one of the Rockefeller family foundations. It wasn't a foundation, it was an organization that did international development. And I was intrigued, again, how there was a systems thinking approach to this work, which I had not expected to find on the right-hand side, so to speak. And yet, consistently saw that people, despite having good intentions and even a lot of resources, I mean, when you're working with the Rockefellers, you have a lot of resources for the most part, and you can convene and bring people into the room, elected officials, heads of state, it doesn't matter, you call and they generally do come. And yet I was not seeing the kind of impact happen in those projects that I think we all hoped were possible and really dreamed were possible. Things were happening, but not at the level we thought. So I, again, grew a little bit disillusioned and happened to come across this work of adaptive leadership. A guy named Marty Linsky, who's one of the founders, came to a retreat that was being held at the Rockefeller Estate, of all places, and he made everyone angry by calling out the obvious, which in that case was that there were not people, while we were helping marginalized people, we said we were with them, they weren't in the room. I know this is something Acumen has struggled with over the years. And that kind of small act of calling people out, I was intrigued by. He ended up not getting hired, for the record. But I was intrigued by, what is the theory, the leadership, the model that he's trying to embody here, and discovered adaptive leadership in that way. So it's been, and then from there, it really evolved into the work I'm doing now, which is really democratizing leadership and bringing this framework of adaptive leadership and other tools out into the world in a bigger way, which we can talk about later. So that's kind of the story, the more, in hindsight, golden thread that I see through all these different disparate moments. But the other story, which is equally as true, is, well, I was, in Japan and I met a girl. She happened to she was from New York, but she was working in Japan. We got married and I came to New York. I was in New York and met a guy who happened to be the head of the organization that was doing this adaptive leadership work in Cambridge at the time, but wanting to bring it to New York. And he looked pretty despondent. And I said, what's wrong? He was a pretty chipper guy overall. And he said, well, my CFO just quit. Do you know one? And I said, well, hire me. He said, what? Do you do finance? I said, no, but I'm an engineer. I can figure it out. And so that was the other kind of somewhat more nonlinear path into this work. But I'm glad I found it. It's been a wonderful gift doing this kind of work of leadership development with pretty extraordinary people throughout the world.
I love how you tell that story with two threads, and that both pieces are true, because that, looking back, you can definitely connect the dots in ways that might not be apparent at the time, but clearly you were meant to be on this path and doing this work either way.
Well, if I could say, I appreciate you noticing that. I think if you were asking what do I do, I think I might say that in a way, I see myself as a storyteller, in that understanding that our world, at least our social world, is built of stories or narratives or myths. And I think these deeper stories of who we are as a people and as a culture are shifting right now. The stories that tell us why we do what we do, what's real and what's possible, how to live a life, how things work on Earth. These are shifting. And so the work of leadership, as we think about it, and adaptive leadership oftentimes is about surfacing and challenging those underlying narratives and stories. And that's deeply disturbing to many people who are wedded to and have a sense of ego and identity that comes from telling themselves the stories they've been told by society, and even by themselves in some ways. So storytelling definitely is core to this work in many ways.
Yes, actually, that's great. I want to come back to Adaptive Change Advisors as a entity, but before that, what do you think is what is the story that leaders tell themselves that you find yourself myth busting the most in your work?
I think it's probably, there's many, but I think probably the one that comes to mind right now is that they got to where they are because of their ego, not despite it. I think that's the biggest thing. It's just, how could I stop doing what I'm doing? This is what got me to where I am. Be that, being a charismatic, quote unquote, leader, or a problem solver, or whatever it may be. But it's this idea that the ego has driven so much, oftentimes, of a founder, a social enterprise startup, or other success. And I kind of pose the possibility, at least, that they got there despite their ego, not because of it. And that kind of turns, that raises the wonderful question, I think, of then who am I becoming? What is it I need to become in the service of the next phase of growth, be it personally, be it in my organization, or in many cases working with Acumen Fellows in the movements that they're leading in their countries. So there's probably others, but that's the one that comes to mind right now.
Yes, that's fascinating. I'd love to dig into that more, but I think we'll save that for the Learning Lab as well, to touch on more of those deeper pieces of the work. You mentioned the Acumen Fellows, and so you've done a lot of work with Acumen and the Fellows on this topic. Can you share your biggest insight from working with some of the Fellows, and maybe a memorable moment working with our Acumen Fellows on leadership?
So many. Good question. I think I think for me, the biggest insight, I'll just share a story. This, I think, captures both biggest insight and an example of working with a fellow. And this is someone you may know, Danielle. His name is Vimal Kumar. Vimal he's a regional fellow in India. And Vimal has a very unique background, even for Acumen fellows, in that he comes from the lowest caste in India. And not only that, but the lowest subcaste, if you want to call it that, within the lowest caste in India. So his technically what they're called is sweepers. Sweepers. So these are oftentimes women that sweep the streets in India. If anyone's been, you'll know who I'm talking about. Often these are the people who will clean the toilets in schools and in people's homes, particularly if there's no running water or piping. They're the ones that will transport the feces and excrement away from the toilet. So this has been the lot that his family and pretty much anyone he's ever been related to for 1,000 years has been cast in life. And I met Vimal as a fellow in a fellowship program, 3 days, after which he said to me afterward, he said, Eric, I want to do this work of leadership development. And very typical of a fellow, just to say that there's such a hunger, such a desire to just go for it, go into the unknown. And he had never done leadership development before, at least so far as he knew. I think he did a lot of it in his life, and he wanted to get into it. And I said to him, Vimal, yes. And I have no idea what it means to say yes, but yes. And so, lo and behold, about 3 months later, I was asked to do a global rollout of leadership development at Microsoft. And so I called Vimal up on WhatsApp. I said, Vimal, here's your chance. You want to do leadership development? Come join me. He said, where is it? I said, well, it's in London. He said, well, I don't have a passport. I don't have a visa. And so we figured that out. And he came and was amazing. Again, just a testament to the fellows and that you guys choose. He knew how to stand in the pain of a Skype executive. This is Skype, right? After they were acquired by Microsoft. Anyone who's gone through what he's gone through in life can understand at some level the human suffering that happens within a corporation, which I don't want to make light of, but it's so different than what he had experienced as a member of the sweeper community. And he was amazing. And then the long story short there was we were taking a walk in Hyde Park in London, which we had done every morning, kind of a reflective, meditative walk. And at some point, he stopped before we entered the park and was looking at something. I couldn't figure out for the life of me what he was looking at. And then it dawned on me that he was looking at a sweeper. It was a London sweeper, but it was, they had the yellow gloves and the yellow boots and the push cart and the proper mop. And he was seeing, anyone he's ever met in his life. And what struck me from that moment was I did not see that man. So here I am with a sweeper, doing this work of leadership development, and I didn't see this person 10 feet in front of me. And of course, Vimal saw that person, but he also saw deeply in me, and I think he saw my shame and my embarrassment in that moment. And he said something so simple, but he said to me, Eric, he said, that man is our brother. And it took me a second for that to even register what he meant by that. And I realized the power of being seen by him, but also the power of his seeing of that individual, and how at its essence, the work, my biggest insight working with not just Vimal, but many fellows, is the depth with which they know how to see others. I think that's one of the greatest gifts we can give. And leadership development, in a way, is about that, which is why he was so good in that Skype executive session. So again, many insights, but that idea of really seeing the brutal reality of where we are, but also, as Jacqueline and others at Acumen would say, the audaciousness of where we want to go, and holding that space of tension in between in a loving way, I think is what I've learned.
That's an amazing story. And so to have that practice or that awareness to see people in greater depth, can you speak a little more about how that looks in adaptive leadership? Because I'm curious, It sounds very impactful, and yet it sounds hard to implement in a way. So what would your connecting the dots be on that idea?
I'm still connecting the dots. That's been ever since I've started working with Vimal and other folks, has been trying to take this work of adaptive leadership, which is a really powerful framework. It came out of Harvard, out of the Kennedy School about 35 years ago. And a lot of my work for the last 15 years has been translating that into day-to-day practice, bringing it into quote unquote the real world. And And that's been really wonderful. But the big aha for me over the last 5 years, after we started ACA, Adaptive Change Advisors, is to make it about the change. It's not about the leadership per se. Leadership for what? People ask me, when they say we want to do leadership development, I say, great, why? And people often haven't thought that far because they have this notion of what leadership is. And so it's a little bit of a non sequitur there, but the point being that this question of why are we doing the leadership work is often about diagnosing not just where we want to go, but where we are. And so the truth-telling aspect of adaptive leadership, what we call the diagnostic piece, a systemic diagnostic, really does in many ways help people both name and have to face the current reality that they're trying to change. And I don't think we can change a current reality unless we perfectly understand it, because there's nothing wrong. As much as we say that people or teams are dysfunctional, the reality is there's nothing dysfunctional about our workplaces. They're perfectly aligned to get the results they're currently getting. There's nothing broken at some level, maybe in a perverse kind of way. And so that I think the being seen question that you're asking is often about seeing our current reality in its fullest, both the part that we want to change, but also the part we don't want to change. Because in honestly, most change is a conservative process, meaning most things don't change in a change process. 95% of things don't change in terms of jobs, structure, processes, culture, etc. And yet we get so focused on that 5%, which is a consequential 5%. Think about the difference between a chimp and a human in terms of DNA. It's much smaller than 5%. It's probably 1% or less. Big difference, right? You change that DNA a little bit, it's a big difference. Same with organizations, but we get so focused on that 5% change, we forget about all the stuff that's not going to change. I think that's really critical, because in messaging change and holding people through a change process, what they're avoiding is not the change per se, it's the loss, right? And so then loss is where the resistance comes from. So I think that's a big insight, is helping people see what they're trying to hold on to, that I think they're afraid of losing in themselves, in their team, in their culture, in their community, and understanding it, then being able to let that go where necessary to create the space for innovation and progress. I think that's an example of how in this leadership framework, the idea of being seen and seeing deeply comes into play.
I love that you talk about having the goal for the change or the goal for the leadership development, right? Because you're right. I mean, it's one thing to dive into these ideas, but for what purpose? And unless you know the purpose, you don't know what to keep and what to work on shifting. So I like how you explain that. You mentioned adaptive change advisors, and at the very start, you mentioned the idea of democratizing leadership. Can you speak more to your goals with adaptive change advisors? You mentioned you're doing the day-to-day application, but what does that look like in a day?
Yeah. Well, and it's funny you say day-to-day, because there's actually some interesting research that shows that on a daily basis, whereas maybe 20 years ago, the average executive had less than 2 leadership moments per day, a moment where they had to make a tough choice in the face of the status quo, a moment where they had to take a stand, perhaps, less than 2 per day. Now, because of all the reasons we well know, the flatter world, less hierarchy in many ways, technology, now the average staff person, meaning me and you, faces 5 or more leadership moments per day. 5 or more. Let's think about it. Did you see it when they came by your desk? Chances are you didn't. I don't either, oftentimes. That's the question for ACA is, can we help people, first of all, see those 5 or more leadership moments that come by their desk every day? And it could be also at home. It could be, standing up to the racist uncle, or, standing up for something in the family, in the community, that people are ignoring because it's inconvenient. It involves some kind of loss. So it doesn't have to just be in the workplace. But once you see those 5 or so moments, do you know what to do? And so our goal is to maximize the possibility that people can be successful in every single leadership moment they face every day. Now, success may mean not engaging in it, because you can't engage in leadership all the time. You can't dole out loss to people all the time, just to use that example, and survive very long. So success often means not engaging in leadership, but it's still a choice. And so what we're trying to help people see the choice they face every single day to engage in leadership or not. There's not a judgment in that. It's not a good or bad. It's just a question of, are you making the right choice for you in the moment and for whoever you're trying to serve? That's what we're really trying to do, is increase that likelihood. And so one way to do that, of course, is to provide access to very high quality leadership development resources, obviously, which is why we love partnering with Plus Acumen. It's been amazing how many tens of thousands of people, if not more, we've reached over the years through that course. And I get stories from people all the time about the power it's had in their lives and in their careers. So that's one way. There's also this second prong to the work, which is working with people like Vimal, because access to ideas is one thing, but people learn leadership from people. So what really excites me is having people locally available in a local language with all the nuances that entails, available to help people exercise leadership in those really tough moments. It's kind of like, back in the day, I think it was Pepsi or Coca-Cola had a motto to have a Coca-Cola within arm's reach of anybody on the planet. I don't know if they got there, but we want to really get to that same aspiration with leadership development. So anyone, anywhere, when they need a moment of courage or insight or diagnosis, they have someone available to them, or a course. And then the third part of democratizing leadership, which is a little bit harder to describe, is the idea not just of democratizing leadership as in scale, but leadership that democratizes. So that kind of flipping the words. And leadership democratizes, not big D democracy. That's not for everybody. Maybe it's not even for people in the United States anymore. I don't even know. But leadership that democratizes, if you think about democracy at its heart, the way I understand it, is, I have one here actually, democratizing leadership. There we go. Just happen to have that available. What he talks about in this book, a guy named Mike Klein, is this, and others talk about this too, by the way, Parker Palmer and others, it's holding conflict creatively. So democracy at its heart is about institutionalizing conflict, because people have multiple realities. People have different views on these issues of our day, be it climate change or health inequity. And so the idea of holding people in that tension in a creative, life-giving way is, to me, what democracy is about. And so leadership that creates that kind of space in organizations, in society, is what we really stand for. And as you may notice, and people on this video may also recognize, this is not about the usual leadership stuff. This is not about leadership with vision and charisma and strength. And those are all helpful. Those are tools. But that's different from this very behavior of trying to hold people in a place of making sense out of problems that have no known or easy answers. That's the essence of adaptive leadership, which is why I love that model. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so maybe just to add some color to that idea and building off what you shared, there's a few core concepts to adaptive leadership that help people apply that idea and hold that space and face those decisions and the status quo in a way where they can move forward or make the choice to not move forward, like you said. So one interesting one is getting up on the balcony. Do you want to speak a little bit to that idea, just to add some color?
Yeah, getting up on the balcony is kind of an age-old idea in a way of getting reflection in the midst of action. So, and this shows up in sports. If you played sports before, being able to see the field, you see some of the best athletes are ones that are not just focused on the play, but they can see, in a way, the entire field of action. In the military, my friends tell me that seeing the field has a different meaning, but kind of getting above the fray. And so it's that idea of getting reflection in the midst of action, which could be something like taking a retreat as a team. It could be doing meditation or yoga in the morning. There's different ways people get distance from the problem at hand, and that's oftentimes where insight and creativity comes from. But one of the first leadership skills we talk about is helping people get on the balcony. And so to play with that metaphor, the idea is you have a dance floor and a balcony. And on the dance floor, you're worried about dance floor stuff. It's dancing to the right tune. It's not looking foolish. It's not stepping on somebody's toes. It's all those kinds of day-to-day choices. And getting on the balcony is about seeing yourself in action, seeing others in action, and being more strategic about how you then intervene back on the dance floor. But because the pressure in organizations and email and all these demands on our time are such that dance floor activity is what's valued, it's really important, if you're going to lead change and mobilize people to tackle these tough challenges, that you have a moment in your life, even every day. Mine is this room right now. In the morning, before the kids wake up and life gets too crazy, and try to spend 3 minutes just getting on the balcony. Why am I here? What's my purpose? What's my work for today? And some other very concrete tools and techniques that we introduce in the adaptive leadership course about how you think on the balcony, think politically, think systemically, and then, of course, always get back on the dance floor. That's where the fun is.
Right. I love that. And to think of it as a frequency. So, like you said, a daily practice or maybe a team retreat. You would want, I imagine, to have that in place at a certain cadence so that you're not losing that opportunity to step on the balcony. But as an individual, even just recognizing once a day to give some space for the perspective, I think that could be a really powerful practice for someone to put into place.
Or joining a fellowship program, which is why I love fellowships. And the regional fellowships in particular at Acumen are great because people are actually working while they are fellows. You have that moment to get on the balcony for a retreat with others, and then actually get in and do the work for the next few months before coming back again. So that rhythm and cadence of balcony work is really important.
Love that. Now, one thing I just want to ask, because you had mentioned in some of our notes before the call that you recently finished a book, Democratizing Leadership in the Age of Authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, the hard word.
I think I might just call it a leadership moment. I think
leadership.
Yeah.
Are you still in the process of working on that, or where are you at in the stage then?
Yeah, I think I'll be rewriting that book in my head for the next 45 years, to be honest. Yeah, I'm still in the process. We'll get it published, I think, hopefully by the beginning of 2020. So right now, just working through all the pre-publication stuff. But it's been a really wonderful process. What we're trying to do in the book is capture the stories of Vimal, of other folks like Vimal, not just in India but around the world, who are by some definition very ordinary people, but doing extraordinary leadership work. We're following Vimal's story. We're following the story of a young guy here in the United States who was leading a clean energy revolution of sorts in really tough places, very anti-climate progress, as some would call it. And then another woman who's doing a lot of work in racial equity and gender equity with more of a faith component. And so we're trying to weave these stories in a way that makes these ideas of adaptive leadership, which could be quite academic sounding, available to anybody. So my ideal readership would be my mother. It would be people who don't think about these things, and yet, in my view, are actually exercising leadership every single day. If we had more of that kind of awareness, I do think that some of the trend toward authoritarianism that we're seeing in the world would be lessened. Because what happens is when we don't see our own capacity for freedom and leadership, we then take that power that we have in ourselves and we project it on others and give them the power, give them our attention, which is a form of power giving. And then, of course, we're disappointed oftentimes at what they do with that power. But even worse, we're really losing our own sense of agency. So that's really the goal, is to reach people who wouldn't be your typical readers of HBR, Harvard Business Review. But at the same time, my guess is that people who do tend to read that kind of literature too will find this quite useful, because it's very practical and, I think, common sense.
Love that. So seeing the stories in action and not and recognizing your own power as a leader in your day-to-day life as well.
Yeah, and the hard part about that book is that it sounds trite, right? We're all leaders. We love to say that nowadays, but what does it really mean to exercise leadership? So what I'm trying to do in this story as well is bring forth my own story and how I learned about leadership, not from a book, not from learning it in school, but from these very individuals and people like them, like the Acumen Fellows. And that's really true, and I want to try to share my own journey in that process, because I do think that's where these ideas come to life, and have some integrity as well. So yeah, we're trying to not just convey the ideas and the stories, but actually convey them in a way that embodies the very ideas that we're trying to convey. So in that, I think there's hopefully integrity that people will feel probably more, beneath the neck, in their guts, in their hearts, in their souls, than just in their heads. Because leadership work happens in both places, below the neck and above the neck. So you'll tell me if we struck that right balance, Daniel, but that's what we're going for.
Well, it sounds amazing. I can't wait to read that myself. So just to wrap up, maybe, if you could only share one piece of advice to somebody whose interest is piqued by this conversation and by adaptive leadership in general, what would your advice be?
I think it would be to get on the balcony, particularly if you're going to join the Learning Lab. We're going to spend some time really trying to understand the tools and the techniques of leadership, but there's no reason to exercise leadership. There's no reason to to get into the area of loss and help people let go of cherished ways of being and doing, unless it's on behalf of some purpose that you hold dearly. And that purpose could be taking care of your family. It could be taking care of your community. It could be a bigger societal issue in some ways. I don't think there's any judgment in that. But when's the last time you had 5 minutes to step back and say, why am I here? Why am I here in front of this computer? Why am I here in this conversation? Why am I here in my organization? Why am I here on Earth? I mean, you can take it as big as you want, but being connected deeply to a sense of purpose, I think, will give you the courage and the stamina and the resilience to lead adaptively, because this is not a spectator sport. So I would say, doing some getting on the balcony time, reflecting on your own purpose, why you want to lead, not just because leadership is good, but leadership for what? I think that might be quite helpful. I'm going to do the same myself here before our learning lab too.
Wonderful. Yes, I love that. Thanks so much for all of that advice and sharing those stories. You have a wealth of examples, sounds like, from your own life and from working with different people to really put these ideas into, like you said, below the neck as well. So thanks for sharing. Any last words before we wrap up?
Just thank you for the time. This has been a lot of fun, and I look forward to the learning lab. It's going to be a lot of fun too, and just the beginning of a journey. Maybe the last thing I'll say is the way I think about leadership is that it is a journey over a lifetime, and what tends to happen, as much as we value leadership, which we all say we do, and I think we should, it's so happenstance. You happen to read a book, learn about leadership, or you happen to have a good leader and learn something from them, or you had a really bad leader and learn what leadership is not. Or you go to a learning lab, but it's such a happenstance thing. And so my question is, how do you develop that leadership over a lifetime? And so I think, learning lab's part of that, but so too are other practices and other things we can be doing afterward to keep embedding this way of working in the world. So that's really, for me, it's not a one-stop, helicopter in, helicopter out of people's lives, but it's a real commitment to help people develop their leadership over a lifetime. Because I think most of the purposes that people have for their lives tend not to be what we would call technical. People seldom say, my purpose in life is to send really good emails. Even though we do that most of the time, hopefully, it tends to have more of this adaptive quality. So I think that's where the leadership is needed in our own lives as well as in our own jobs. So yeah, that's the thought I think I would leave us, is more of an invitation into that lifelong journey of leadership.
Wonderful. That's a perfect place to end.